그 관련된 걸 행사를 시작하겠습니다. 행사 이제 우리 오늘 일정에 대해서는 일단은 우리 유 선생님 오늘 발표하신 선생님에 대해서 우리 원영수 우리 상임연구원께서 간단한 소개와 오늘 할 주제에 대해서 간단하게 말씀을 하시면 그 이후에 오늘 발표하시는 우리 선생님께서 30분 동안 발표를 하시고 거기에 대해서 또 정보는 알지만 간단하게 원영수 연구원께서 이렇게 간단한 얘기하고 그 다음에 질의응답으로 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 기본적으로는 동시 통역은 안 하겠습니다. 그렇지만 이제 꼭 필요한 부분에는 중간중간에 원영수 연구원께서 하실 거고요. 그래서 자 그러면 우리 그때 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 원영 선생님 간단하게.
네, 반갑습니다. 원영수입니다. 복잡하게 제가 설명드릴 건 아니고 그냥 오늘 모임을 갖게 된 예를 말씀드리자면 서로 알고 지낸 지 한 15년 정도 되는 것 같아요. 한 15년 전에 이마누엘 네스 뉴욕 시립대학 교수.
여기 시립대.
네, 시립대
교수가 하셨죠.
지금 계속하고 still quite long. How many years?
20.
20.
In faculty. Oh no, maybe. Oh, well, you and I know each other since 2011. No, 2008.
So it's about
15 years. Yeah, I thought you meant how long I was at CUNY. When we did the
그 당시에
the Revolution Encyclopedia.
네스 교수가 이제 굉장히 운동과 투쟁의 역사에 대한 책들을 굉장히 많이 편집해서 낸 책들이 많이 있어요. 그래서 2008년도에 한 프로젝트가 이제 International Encyclopedia of Revolution and Protest from 1500 to the present. 500년의 세계 혁명과 투쟁 역사를 8권으로 놨어요. 8권으로 책을 만들었어요. 3,800페이지짜리. 제가 우리 웹사이트에 I shared the PDF file with colleagues here. 그 책 할 때 이제 제가 소개 받아가지고 한국 과외 운동에 관한 거를 이제 쓰게 된 거죠. 그런 다음에 계속 시간이 기회가 될 때마다 만나게 되고 최근에는 거의 1년, 2년에 한 번씩은 이제 만나고 있습니다. 그래서 이제 기본적으로 네스 교수는 노동자와 민중들이 이 세상을 어떻게 이제 바꿔왔는지 그 기록들을 추적하는 거고 그런 부분에서는 저와 이제 관심과 연구 영역이 이제 비슷하죠. 그래서 더 친해진 것 같고요. 근데 최근에 이제 Organizing Insurgency라고 해서 반란을 조직하다. 그래서 이제 글로벌 사우스 이게 한국말로 번역이 되게 힘든데 남방구 하면 말이 좀 껄쩍지근 하거든요. 근데 어쨌든 그냥 넓게 얘기하면 그냥 제3세계 노동자들의 운동이 글로벌 자본주의 시스템에 대한 반란을 이끌고 있다라고 하는 것이고, 그래서 이제 이 책은 그러니까 약간 좀 설명하시겠지만은 하여튼 이제 그런 관점에서 역사적 흐름 부분과 그다음에 이제 세 가지 사례 인도와 필리핀 그리고 남아공 노동자들의 투쟁을 다루고 있다. 바로 최근에 나온 5월달인가 나온 책이어서 굉장히 따끈따끈한 책이니까 오늘 이 책에 대해서 얘기를 듣도록 하겠습니다. I made a very short introduction on this, and you can introduce yourself if you want.
Okay.
And you can make some presentations on this. Go ahead, please.
I would like to thank the Korean Institute for Political Economy for inviting me to this meeting. I would also like to thank Wan Young Soo for facilitating this engagement, which I think is fundamental in understanding where we are politically. I think we are starting to ask the same questions about the left. Certainly socialism is a ideal that we share. The idea of socialism from a Marxist perspective, that is. And one of the main points of contention is how do you build power within the context of actually existing socialism today or in the past and in the future. And we have endured over the last 20 years or so a distortion of, in my view, of Marxism by new perspectives that claim to be Marxist, but in fact fundamentally conflict with the major theme of class struggle and the idea of political economy and the division between, moving a little back, labor and workers and owners and so forth. This new socialists that emerged in the West, primarily the United States, include, the Hart and Negri faction and other people who believe in technology as the answer. We saw in the last 10, 15 years in the West and yet throughout the world, and I don't think Korea, but even in this part of the world, the popular movements that were considered to be the answer. So one of the examples would be the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement would be another. And so people paid tribute to the incredible capacity of workers, so to speak, to have the ability to challenge capitalism or to challenge capital and to express their disdain for capital, exploitation of labor and the system that is supported by the state. So the understanding is very clear that the state is, I don't want to become, too analytic, but the state does, in a certain concrete way, I think without a doubt, represent the interests of the capitalist class in each country. And I think the work of Nikos Poulantzas and other scholars that have analyzed the structural relationship between the state and the state and the capitalist class is very clear. Poulantzas making the case that really the people who are running for office within the contours of the capitalist state are unable to break that bondage because whether they're socialists or whether they're Marxists or not, the system itself is structured in a way that those movements would be marginalized. Just getting back for a few moments to the point that I made earlier, that this celebration of class consciousness that has emerged, I find to be something that is fundamentally incorrect in the sense that it marginalizes the movements that have existed throughout time and throughout the period of capitalism, that we have had examples of class struggles, anti-imperialist movements, popular movements from peasants, etc., throughout the history of capitalism. It is not something that is particularly unique to the present era. I think where what we do have is somewhat of a break in the sense that people have become more conscious of the power of a working class and the division between a working class and a powerful capitalist class. So my argument in this book is that the idea that workers are engaged in struggle is something that's very important. Shall we celebrate it? I do not think so, because we should expect it to happen as long as capitalism is around. And the degree to which capitalism becomes more rapacious and more exploitative, one can expect in most instances that people will resist. So I break this fundamental notion that people are going to somehow, in the contemporary era, engage in a form of class struggle that is higher than other levels in the past. What I argue is that there is a missing point, that much of the literature on the left, I just want to say that this does not come out of thin air. It comes from the basic arguments that we've had. You know, what kind of left? How do we challenge the state and capitalist system and so forth? And there are many different strands of thought within that context. There has been, over the course of the last 20 to 25 years, an ascendancy, let's say, of the political thinkers who are leftists, that we don't need any party whatsoever, that the workers will just do it on their own. And even organizations themselves, you know, refer to the terminology bottom-up politics when they're in fact doing top-down politics at the same time. This book is not making a major claim, except it's arguing that it is incorrect to view popular struggles that are successful as independent of socialist and Marxist political organization. It argues strongly that in order to have a successful struggle, there is a need for a organizational infrastructure that is capable of challenging power. Now, of course, in each of the cases, we have the Philippines, India, and South Africa. Power has not been won by the working class. In fact, in India, it might be most difficult in some ways. But I provide 3 case studies that show that workers will be, in fact, more emboldened when there is a party, a political party of a socialist or Marxist nature that also advances the idea of opposition to imperialism. I wanted to speak very briefly about the question of imperialism, especially economic imperialism, that in this world of 8.5 billion people, somewhere near 90% of the population live outside of the core countries and are marginalized and are actually serving the interests of the core countries. And that this is probably one of the more controversial points that I do make in this book, that the populations as a whole in the rich countries are in fact part of an imperialist system and are beneficiaries of global value chains and so forth that allow for the commodification of labor in the global south as part of global supply chains. And so the case would be that this is something I've been very much concerned with over the last 10 or more years. We've completely neglected the fact that the vast majority of workers in the world are living outside of the core. So, it's basically, 1 billion people or so that are living well or surviving okay, not necessarily completely well. And then the rest, 7.5 billion of the population is living extremely poorly. And a lot has to do with the question of labor. So that's another strand of this book. Within the context of the second one, I also point out in this book as a kind of an extension of an earlier book that I wrote called Southern Insurgency, where I do point out the fact that workers are employed in some of the most highly technological industries, that in fact, workers are also employed in some of the least technologically advanced sectors of the economy. I know that we have some distinguished guests here. And I wanted to also say thank you for coming, and people who are viewing this event that who are experts, political economists, political scientists, and so forth and so on. And so I just want to make the point that within this context that, we do have an oversupply of labor on the planet, and there is a high degree of exploitation. So in that work, I paid tribute to the levels of struggle, autonomous struggle, struggles that are taking place with very weak organizations that are formed by the workers themselves in many instances. And what this book does, in contrast to my previous work, is that it makes the very, very strong case for organization. But just stepping back for a moment, I look at the cases of industries, just stepping back, that have a very limited subsumption of capital, where there is at the level of production, at least, a limited investment of capital, where we would expect, if we take a look at the high-tech sectors of the economy, there is a high degree of investment. We're looking at industries also in the world that have very low investment. So as Marx puts it, a low subsumption of capital. In this case, the production of food and crops, agribusiness, tropical fruits. It could also include the production of mining and the production of ore, as well as steel production and other basic industries that are not capitalized to a great extent. I mean, one can go even further. There isn't an example here, but one could examine, for instance, the production of garments and clothing as another case where, we have this propensity to look at this high technology world when in fact much of the world is not as high technology as we are led to believe. As a corollary to this argument, as a side point to the argument, I make the case that many of you know the work of Mike Davis. He was just documenting a historical fact that took place 15, 16 years ago, maybe 17 years ago, 2004, where the world became majority urban, according to his perspective, and according to the United Nations, etc. And I challenge that perspective in the sense that if we take a look at urban, we should be a bit more careful in structuring that kind of conversation. So let me just take a drink of water. And
what was the name, Mike?
Mike, short for Michael, but he calls himself Mike Davis, D-A-V-I-S. And he's a leading scholar. His works are very, very interesting. He wrote a very important book on the working class of the US called Prisoners of the American Dream. Yeah, the name of the book is called Planet of Slums. Planet of Slums, yes.
Mark Davis?
Yes, Mike did. Yeah. 2004, 2005. So in this case that we all have the sense that we're, being urban is good and being rural is something backward. And so I challenge that general notion in this work. So for instance, if we take a look at the 8 billion plus on the planet, less than 4 billion live in rural areas. I mean, the population of the planet in the year 1900 was about 1 billion, all of them in rural areas. So over the course of the last 120 years or so, the population in rural areas has more than tripled. Yet at the same time, urbanization is seen as a positive advance on the economy. Yet at the same time, we find ourselves that in urban areas, we really have rural forms of life, in fact, worse than rural forms of social reproduction, to use Marxist terminology. By that, I mean, the fact is that in many of the urban areas, we're really looking at really a planet of slums, where there is no clean water, where there is no sanitation, where there is no electricity, where there is no healthcare, where housing is far below any kind of standards that are one can, exist in a reasonable way. I visited many of them, and I continue to in my work. Hopefully when the pandemic comes to an end, we'll have have a chance to do more of that work. But many people in these areas that are deemed to be urban are really living lives that are far more impoverished than those that are in rural areas. So, in rural areas, there is at least a form of subsistence. You can grow crops on your own and so forth. Although there is increasingly a rural working class, that in itself is a debate that we can have for several hours about the nature of the transformation from a rural peasantry to a rural working class in places like India and the Philippines, as well as South Africa. The working class has become the peasantry has become a working class that works for a living and does not have the ownership over any kind of means of production, and does daily labor. So in any case, just taking this further, I look at 3 case studies. In each of them, we have some significant movements of different sizes. I would say in each of the countries, Philippines, India, and South Africa, we're looking at movements in the millions of people, and movements that have a potential to take state power. And so I actually touch on that question, but I don't necessarily take it on in a direct way, but I argue, sort of insinuate that these are possibilities for revolutionary transformation. So the term organizing insurgency really is a play on words, that we have insurgencies that are taking place, but they're not organized. Workers are engaged in struggle, but those struggles are short in length, and they are not necessarily broad organizational formations that are capable of taking on state and corporate and imperialist power. And so I do think that in a number of countries, there is a distinct possibility of taking state power. These are countries that possess a specific type of economy, an economy that is at if you read the work of Lenin and so forth, at the lowest point of the chain, so to speak, the lowest level of economic capitalist formation. in which the working class is the most oppressed. And I think we could agree that the three of the countries that I looked at are amongst them. They would be, again, in the case of the Philippines, you have a major movement that is comprised of many different organizations, yet there is a degree of centralization to some degree that are opposing state power. There is a opposing the state power that actually exists under the present system, and seek to create a new Philippine state. And I believe it's a very strong movement. I believe that there are many working class movements that are mobilized by organizational leaders who are Marxists of one kind or another in India that are intent on taking state power. That would be a very hard, difficult task, but in some ways it may not be as difficult as we think because of the number of geographic features that India has and other countries don't. India does have a very strong tradition of Marxism, and especially amongst its intellectuals, and one that remains highly developed. Yet there is, or there are many different strands of Marxism that exist in India, and different perspectives on how organization should take place, which I think is a good thing. Some people say organize in the rural areas, others say organize urban areas, others say organize both. In South Africa, the situation is one that has not come to a resolution whatsoever. The level of inequality in South Africa has grown since the end of apartheid, which, now that I think about it with respect to Korea, the mass movements in South Africa came to a unfolding and a blossoming at the same time as Korea and Brazil. I remember reading the literature of the time around Korea, South Africa, and Brazil as the three examples of countries that are ripe for revolution. I do think Korea does represent some very interesting dynamics, however, especially given its recent traumatic history. And by what I mean by recent, I'm going back to the beginning of the 20th century. So anyway, this book is in general one that is a positive book, and it looks at the movements. And the final one that I looked at was South Africa. In that case, I see the possibility of a new formation emerging out of the wreckage of the ANC tripartite alliance that is currently in power. And that would be one that would, of course there are critics, but I'm not going to be one of them, that would be led by NUMSA, the trade union that formed the federation, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, along with a new party, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, which people criticized in its first election in 2019, 2019, because they didn't get enough votes. And well, if you want to make that claim, you can say that every movement starts somewhere, and they can perhaps advance and do better if they're organized better. I am not making any claims in terms of how these, how specific movements can do things better. I'm just pointing in a direction of movements that have made significant gains in increasing and improving the conditions of labor for the working classes that they are responsible for in those countries. They are not necessarily going to be sustained without a durable organization. So it's important for those organizations to remain powerful or to increase in power if the workers are going to have a greater say. Of course, we are all, in the final instance, left with the problem of capitalism. And I think I come across very clearly arguing that, we have to end capitalism. But I'm not in a utopian way whatsoever, but in a tangible way that the structures of capitalism are taken down and new social structures are created. How that's done is something that I also do not provide a prescription for. I'm not at that. I think we would probably have to work as a group to, and maybe many people around the world have to work together on deciding on how and what needs to be done. But there are many who are thinking about it and who are engaging in various forms of struggle. So for instance, in the Philippines, the struggle is more ecumenical. People are interested in building broad alliances with various parties, even if they, and movements, even if there is a difference of opinion on a specific question. They are not dogmatic. And I'm talking about the major movements in the Philippines. In the Indian case, I think there's a little bit more of dogmatism, but not in a bad way necessarily, but in a way that is principled in their own way. Obviously, each group, we're dealing with politics too, so each group does seek to take power in a tangible manner. So I will just leave my comments now, and I'm sure there might be a lot of questions. I spoke for more than 30 minutes, and wondering if people would like to, I'm sure people have ideas or questions or comments, really, more so comments. Help us understand.
제가 뭐 간단하게 이어갈까요? I'm going to make just a second, please. I'm going to make a very short summary for this presentation for friends. 기본적으로 네스 교수는 이제 그 기존 좌파들이 관념적으로 이렇게 평하는 것들 되게 비판적으로 바라보고 있고, 그다음에 이제 2000년대 이후의 트렌드, 이제 소위 오토노미스 경향에서의 해석이 기존의 낡은 형태의 정당과 관계없이 잘 될 것이다, 이런 거에 대해서 상당히 비판적으로 보는 거죠. 현실적으로 이제 지금 냉정하게 지금 현재 세계를 바라보자면 그 하이테크 자본주의가 존재하는 부분은 일부분에 불과하고 1억 명 정도 10억 명 정도가 혜택을 보는 거고, 사실 그 나머지 75억은 혜택을 받지 못하는 세계에서 사라진 서양 사회로 하는 것들이 전 세계적으로 볼 여전히 그 노동자들을 착취하고 자본주의 유지하는 시스템을 작동하고 있다는 이런 거죠. 그래서 이제 과거 여전히 이제 사실 이제 그 전 세계 모든 곳에서 민중들의 주장 노동자 운동은 이제 발전하고 있다라는 게 이제 진단이죠. 그러니까 기존 좌파들이 끝났다 아니다 이제 이런 태제들에 대해서 오히려 실사구시적인 측면에서 현실의 수장을 가지고 선의 판단을 하고 있는 거고, 그런 주장을 하시는 거고, 그래서 이제 사례로는 이제 실제로 투쟁을 하고 있는 인도와 필리핀, 그다음에 남아공 이쪽에 제가 뭐 구체적인 사례에 대해서는 설명은 그것도 굉장히 주제이기 때문에 이제 생략을 하겠는데, 어쨌든 사실 거의 모든 곳에서 지난 10년, 20년 동안 노동운동 끝났다고 하는 주장은 반대로 오히려 실제 노동자 투쟁들은 벌어지고 있고, 그다음에 정당이 필요 없다고 얘기하자면 오히려 이 세 사례에서는 어떤 형태의 이제 어떤 이제 막스주의적 또는 아니면 사회주의 정당들이 문제가 있음에도 불구하고 이들의 역할들이 노동력등의 활성화에 중요한 역할을 하고 있다라는 사실을 이제 적시를 하는 거죠. 그래서 현재 상태에서 이런 노동자들의 투쟁들은 이제 현실적으로 권력을 장악하려고 하는 움직임까지 이제 보이고 있다라는 것이고, 그런 그 포텐셜을 충분히 보여주고 있다고 생각을 하는 거죠. 그러니까 이제 결국 돌아와서 좌파가 이제 궁극적으로 이 자본주의와 어떻게 싸워야 할 것인지를 통해서 이제 그 반자본주의를 형성시켜야 되는데, 그거는 그냥 유토피아적 방식이 아니라 구체적으로 이제 구조적 자본주의를 어떻게 없애타도하고 새로운 사회주의적 인프라스트럭처를 건설할 것인가. 그다음에 이런 것들은 고립적으로 되는 게 아니라 지금 전 세계 여러 곳에서 다양한 그룹들이, 그러니까 과거처럼 이렇게 과거에 상상했던 것처럼 반일한 형태는 아니지만 오히려 그것들이 서로 경쟁과 반대의 부작용들이 좀 있긴 하지만 역동적으로 긍정적인 효과를 만들어내고 있다라고 간단하게 요약하면 이 정도. I just summarize your argumentation, and as a moderator, I want to enjoy my privilege to comment. Very short. Yes, I agree in many aspects. So, in some sense, your argumentation is kind of a realistic critique toward the autonomist approach, and more realistic approach in terms of political and movement terrains. So, and many are rather pessimistic, but you're still optimistic.
Yeah.
And you, based on the three cases, that can be cause of debate. Okay. That's just my commentation, your presentation, and we are going to start question and answer.
I say in Hangul.
Hangul is I don't prefer to talk Korea because maybe you have many questions about that, but Korean is very hard to define because we more delicate. But maybe after we.
No, I thought you may want to translate it. What you just said.
I translate your presentation very shortly, and thing I said is my comment or opinion to your presentation, and Nata is going to ask questions or comment.
Yeah. First, I want to say.
Microphone for the Zoom audience.
Did they hear what because they
No. We are fine, but it's for Zoom audience.
Hello? So first I wanted to say because yeah, I think it's really amazing what you said, that there are huge mass movements in the South, like in India and South Africa. I never heard of it, but interesting. And, somehow, of course, as a socialist, you will know that there are such movements. You hear all the news and every day you can see everything in SNS. But that you said that, it was really somehow really touched me. It's amazing. I think one can do something with that. But yeah, there's this reality that there are huge movements somewhere in the world. They are huge. They are like millions, as you said. But in countries like here, in South Korea, or even more so maybe in Germany, you don't feel that. I mean, you hear it, but you don't feel it because you're living in another world. And for me, this is really a very important part. How do you think would one connect this? I mean, how, because at one point, these huge movements will, I mean, there will be maybe someday some kind of bottleneck. They will explode, but maybe at that time in the industrialized nations, there's nothing. still, nothing is still like there from history. How can we be prepared? I mean, now in Germany, I know that the several communist or socialist organizations, they are more fighting each other. I guess in the UK it's the same, or in the US it's the same too. So how can we prepare better? How do you have a recipe?
Yeah, I will not certainly, thank you very much for those comments. They actually were very correct, in my view, absolutely spot on, correct. I'm not an expert in Korea. I have studied some of the industries. I need to do more, but it's, I think, increasingly a country that's dependent on labor, not just its own labor, but increasingly labor from other countries. They are highly exploited laborers, but also Korean workers. There are Korean workers that also are getting fairly high wages in this country. Probably a minority of them. I think most, people will point to workers at Hyundai and say that that's the model, but I don't think that's necessarily the case whatsoever. I think most are probably more precarious than that. But even if that were the case, we're not talking about a country like in the same category of third world countries where there's absolute poverty. Korea for the last 40 years, yes, or something like that. In the literature, you'll note that it is a country that's been considered a new economic industrializing country. And now it is industrialized. It's a member of the OECD and so forth. With respect to Germany, and maybe this is true for Korea, but less so, there's been, and you know much more than I do about Germany, obviously the Schroeder government has cut back many of the social programs that existed. Ironically, again, we see the Social Democrats at work. So I think that we should put that to rest, any kind of hope in a social democracy or democratic socialism as an answer. Because they will in fact lead to greater levels of economic inequality and poverty in places like Germany. I think that's been proven to be the case, as in Britain, and actually not so much in France. But in any case, there's been a severe attack against the working class throughout the global north. Over the course of the last 40 years of the neoliberal period of capitalism, and that has extended into to the global south, where wages and working conditions, but just living conditions as a whole, are, I would say, below really. They're extremely low, notwithstanding the data that is provided by these millennial estimates about eliminating poverty by X year and so forth. That really has not been done. In fact, who was it who wrote the piece recently? Yes, it was Mark Weisbrot, who wrote a book on China, who said that, in fact, China was more responsible for eliminating poverty than any other country in the world. Of course, China, having its own system, which has got certainly capitalist influences. So so in the case of Germany and South Korea, the workers are not in the same condition, and our beneficiary, or the working classes, are beneficiaries. I don't want to say the working classes, so I use the population as a whole as a beneficiary, and this goes back to of imperialism, economic imperialism. And it goes back to the debates that were going on with Marx and Engels when they characterized the British working class, industrial working class, as a form of a labor aristocracy, or an aristocracy of labor, because they were unwilling to form alliances with workers outside of of Britain and so forth. So for instance, the Irish workers were in a very poor condition as a consequence of British imperialism in that country that only ended after a anti-colonial struggle. Yet what remains today in the post-colonial era is actually a form of economic imperialism that is as deep, if not deeper, than existed before, and has created sharper differences amongst populations on a global scale. So interestingly enough, I was just mentioning earlier to Juan that I'm working with the Left Forum, and we put on a tribute to Leo Panich, who passed away from coronavirus in December of this year, which I liked. Many of you probably knew or know of him. He's a decent human being. So I thought it was fitting because he was a very open person to, even though he had his own perspective and beliefs, to the idea that movements could emerge from outside of the establishment. With the collapse of Syriza and the Labour Party experiment under Corbyn, I think he became even more less, let's just say, less sanguine about the possibilities of transformations that could take place. So I think, you raised that very critical question about who is the working class. And, I think that if we look at the demands that are being made by the American working class, one that is fairly well-to-do, I really mean that in a, with respect to compared to other workers, I don't think they're doing extremely well and so forth. But, I just read the other day in the Financial Times that, or was it the Wall Street Journal, that the standard of living has gone up during the coronavirus globally. Just to give you an example, especially in the global north. Just to give an example of the kinds of questions. Yeah, not here, certainly not here, I don't think. I don't know, but I think actually Korea has been hurt by the coronavirus, very devastated in some ways. By and large, that is the point. So, I think that's the crucible that has been raised by a growing number of scholars. The question of how are we going to characterize a working class, and one that has, let's put it this way, a sense of self and class identity, based on that identity that is rooted, in my view, must be rooted in organizational identity. I think there are possibilities that, yes, all of us will see take place within the next 10 years or so. I expect us to see some kind of transformation, which raises another question, and I don't want to talk for too long, but about socialism in one country. I know that that's a controversial issue, but I do believe that it is, if you have a big enough country, I think it's definitely possible. Absolutely possible. I don't think it could be done in a very small country in a tangible way. But, that's actually something that would be a very interesting basis for a conference. Just that question.
그러면 시간상 지금도 질의응답은 통역을 생략을 좀 하고 있습니다.
그래, 간단한 거.
예. 예, 간단하게.
이게
아니,
영어로 제대로 하는 분 세 분밖에 안
아니,
계시잖아요.
저기-
우리 다 아니니까. 그래.
시간상 다시 재원할 필요 없죠. 여기 이제 온라인에서 우리 정민영 선생님이 직접 질의를 한다니까 일단 질의응답은 시간상 우리가 통역은 좀 어려울 것 같아요.
예, 약간 저는
정민영 선생님 들리세요? 정진영 선생님 음소거
아, 네, 잘 들립니다. 네, 네.
질문해 주시면 됩니다.
아, 그렇습니까? Hi, Immanuel. Nice meeting you. Your great show presentation. Welcome to the sub-imperialist South Korea as a vanguard of a U.S. imperialist in East Asia. Yeah, you are already a member of South Korea sub-imperialist academic world. Welcome again. Yes. Okay. Immanuel, I'm actually talking to you in city of Los Angeles right now. We are both staying and living in the global north. Okay. Really, you talk about global value change. Just about 10 minutes ago, I ordered your book via Amazon.com, a Kindle edition. I'm looking at your book in my cell phone right now. Okay, we are living in the world like this. Okay, let me stop here and then very quickly for our monitors and the participants, let me tell you, and then I'm gonna back to my seat. It would be very superficial, but I'm asking you, not actually, I wanna listen to you. You are saying in your title, insurgency. In South Korea, mostly activists and researchers in the academic world in South Korea, they are used to say uprising, not actually insurgency. If I add one thing, you know, South Korea, we used to be called, not really name of a state, used to be called Korea Peninsula. It's really, I'm the person hate to say to be called Korea Peninsula. Why? The people here, we have 2 or more restrictions. First of all, ideological restrictions like this: North and South, communist or capitalist, socialist or revisionist. In and out, people are used to be afraid of these restrictions, to be caught by their reactionaries. I'm talking about progressive, liberal political power, or extreme reactionary group, whichever activists and researchers in the academic world, they are really, including me. I'm actually 2 months later, I need to show in the retrial under the John Doe Hwan massacre regime. I was arrested, and then there's a trial in September. Yeah, that's about 41 years ago. Now, let me go back to my topic. So that's the restriction I'm talking about. The second, why we used to say uprising? Because activists and researchers, they do not want to touch on the limit, not cross the limit. Oh, we are not aiming at grabbing, occupying, and they kept taking the political power. We are rebelling. We are doing as an uprising for protection of our basic rights, our democratization, or even in the small scale, capitalist democracy, whichever.
선생님 죄송한데 시간상 그러니까
Now,
질문을
let me go
요약해서
back to
말씀하세요.
finish my question. So, you understand, already you are in South Korea. You understand very much our political environment. So let me finish my like a question, like not really question, but question like listening to you. Why you say express insurgency about the movements of the global South, and what do you think any different characteristics between insurgency in your book title and uprising in South Korea's social movement used to be called? Thank you.
네, 선생님 질문 간단히 말하면 제3세계 남미에서는 인서전시라는데 한국에서는
제가 그 얘기를 할게요.
예, 예. 아니요.
제가 얘기한
선생님
것은
됐습니다. 그거에 대해서 이제
남한에서 그 보통
네, 선생님
항쟁,
같이 아니 선생님
uprising이라고 그러지,
예, 예.
insurgency라는 말을 잘 안 쓰는데, insurgency는 영어로 말하면 거칠게 말하면 반역, 반란
선생님
이런 뜻으로 많이 쓰는데,
예, 그 두 가지 차이점을 질문하신 게 전달이 됐으니까요.
in Korea.
예, 답변 드리겠습니다.
Both word, the insurgency and the uprising is the same word.
Yeah, it's sort of the same.
Same, but actually last time I translated George's book, so many words about insurgency and uprising, but
Yeah, I agree. I mean, just talking to Juan about his notion that the two words are interchangeable. And what's the name of the gentleman who just spoke? So I can address directly, if he wants to give his name. So
정진영,
정지영. Yeah.
graduate of National University 경상. He is our alumni.
A very, very erudite man, and when you think about it a little bit more than just a lot of these titles are made not by the author but by the publisher. I may have had a different name for the book, but I'm happy with the title. Actually, I helped develop the title. But let me just reach the point. I actually think an uprising is something that is more dramatic than an insurgency. I think you're right. There's something about an uprising which is what I would say is that insurgency takes place all the time. It is continuous. And that's why I say organizing. An uprising is a specific set of events that takes place, like a rebellion that occurs.
it's
I mean,
more spontaneous.
Yeah, that takes place and needs to be, but the insurgency is something that is part of a general, pattern of action. And I'm arguing that the working class is in a state of insurgency on a global level. I mean, the history of Korea is one that I would say is, one of the most interesting of the world. I read Cummings' work and others, and consider the struggles of the people of this country to be heroic. Like I said earlier, especially the 1930s to 1950s. So I have great admiration, and that raises a lot of questions about, you did raise the question about Korea, so I think people here probably know more about what is so important about the uprisings to, bringing a certain sense of dignity. I believe that this country is a dignified country in any case, to the population, because this is a former, it's been colonized, this country, for a period of time during the last century, not so long ago, and uprisings were necessary to change that. And so was political party, which may still be in existence today, but we may want to change. That we were talking about the North Korea question, right? Is that party, the North Korea was the People's Party in North Korea its early leadership was engaged in leading those uprisings. I believe probably throughout the peninsula, but I'm not sure because I'm not an expert. And I don't know if anybody else can speak to that issue.
Agnes, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, shall I use the mic?
Sure. Okay.
I have actually 3 questions. I'll do it very briefly.
Too many.
The first one is, why did you choose these 3 particular countries for your book? Will be interesting to know the rationale of your choice. And number 2, unfortunately, I haven't got a chance to read your book yet. Perhaps you have already mentioned it. How do you see the relationship between these workers' movements vis-a-vis the state? Because we know Modi, as the Prime Minister of India, is fascist. We know Duterte is fascist. We know that South Africa today is ruled by a black ruling elite that's basically throwing the black poor under the bus. So they have, I imagine there will be some very complex relationship, and I hope if you could explain that relationship. How do they deal with the state? How do they negotiate with the state, or are they completely resisting and not working with the state? So the state and movement relationship. And then the very last one is actually, I'm very intrigued by what you said about the rural community turning into working class, rural working class. If you would like to explain more based on what you have observed, how does the rural community now become ruling the rural working class?
핵심을 잡아서 설명해주고 간단하게 번역을 또 이렇게 얘기를 해줘야 다른 사람들이 참
세 나라를 선택한 이유, 근거가 첫 번째 포지션이고, 두 번째는 이제 그 각 나라에서 그 노동자 운동과 국가 간의 관계에 대해서 설명했던 것이고, 마지막은 이제 주장 중에는 지금 전 세계적 차원에서 볼 때는 이제 농촌 사회가 이제 과거는 그 소농민 중심인데 지금은 농업 노동계급의 형성이 되고 있다고 하는데, 그거에 대해서 좀 더 자세한 설명을 요구하셨습니다.
Thank you for those brilliant questions. And I think each of them are important. You know, one of them is about me, really. Why did I pick those 3 countries? So I'll start there. My interest is in the global South because I recognize that's where the height of oppression is. And this is not just a passing fad. It's something that has been with me since I was a young child in some respects, recognizing the oppression of countries and peoples by an imperialist order. When I was an undergraduate, I was studying South Africa, and I recognized the fact that you, and it's also related to your second question to some great degree. Many people who studied South Africa in the 1980s and so forth and so on were very disappointed to see what became of it. I think I'm amongst those people who was certainly disappointed, but I feel that as an optimist, in the sense that being more optimistic about the possibilities, I still see it as a center of political class struggle that requires organization that can take it to another level. There is no question, not just a South Africa, but a Southern Africa is what's necessary. I mean, what is the difference between Namibia and South Africa? It's very little in some respects. They're all basically extractive economies and so forth, and they haven't really developed the means of production or the society for the people themselves. So that's a long lasting interest of mine, as is India. which I've been studying for at least 20 years, and going back on a regular basis to examine the political formations there. I find India to be also a place where, I'll be honest with you, from a personal perspective, I'm free to speak as I wish about politics, and without being chastised as one would in many other parts of the world, especially the United States. Certain words are not considered to be terrible. The idea of, yes, there was a Soviet revolution that took place. There were problems with it, but we still should say that there was some benefit that emerged as a consequence of that. Even in the early years, we can say, I won't, because I don't want to go too far with this. In China, there was a revolution that took place, and it was successful in ousting the imperialists. And that was the first goal. And in the second instance, it increased life expectancy, literacy rates, incomes, and so forth. I'm referring to the period between 1949 and 1976. I'm not going too far into that. But in any case, in a place like India, you can have those kinds of discussions with intellectuals. And also, I became very interested in, during the 1990s, the shift in production that took place, not from the United States and the West, and this goes to the earlier points that were made, to the global South. So in some ways, Germany is not an industrialized, well, it is, they've remained an industrialized country, but the United States is, to some degree, not really an industrialized country in the same way. They control the levers of industrialization. They're at the foremost position, as Samuel T. King in his recent book a book that will be coming out soon, argues that there's a kind of a hierarchy of capitalism where the United States is at the top. The Philippines, I came to rather late in 2017 or so. A comrade of mine was in New York, and she encouraged me to visit and to spend time there over the last several years, and that's what I did, and will continue to do. I plan on going back as soon as it's possible. Not to say that I think we all, every one of us, could make a contribution there. It's a place where there's also this kind of sense that of possibility, and that's actually what unifies those three countries: South Africa, Philippines, and India. The sense of what you mentioned, Modi, Duterte, and the leader of South Africa, Ramaphosa, who's actually, in my view, responsible for a massacre that took place in 2012 in Marikana, which killed 34 mine workers. He called for the massacre, and everyone knows that. And yet he's now the president of South Africa. Well, I should also say that I also teach in South Africa, so I feel free to say that here. Because it's true and everyone knows it. And it's one of the major points is that, there is absolutely no concern whatsoever amongst the ruling classes in each of these countries. Yet, Ramaphosa used to be charismatic. I don't think he is to any great degree anymore, but he used to be, the sidekick of Mandela. Duterte has a form of charisma, and so does Modi in their own way, and they are able to mobilize workers in the wrong way. And that's actually, I think it's a very important point that you made with respect to the relationship of workers to the state. I mean, one can go back to the question that, again, you raised about fascism. And to have a fascism, you need a ruling class that is devoted to a form of nationalism that takes people away from their class identities and pushes them increasingly toward They're nationalists, they're religious, they're ethnic, their caste, and other kinds of identities. And that certainly has happened in places in each of these countries. Increasingly, unfortunately, in South Africa, people view themselves as Xhosa and Zulu, etc., rather than South African, though I actually think that bond of being South African is really strong. And why the rule? So both the first and second questions are really related. And I think there could be, I would love to be part of a research group examining the kinds of fascism that are emerging in the global South as a way to placate a very activist working class. Yes, so one of the case studies, and it's the chapter in the book that's on the Philippines, which is, sorry for that, chapter 4, and it deals with the question of tropical fruit production, especially bananas, and in this case, there was the People's Power Revolution of 1986 that took place, where people thought that the working class would gain power, but in fact, the power of the ruling class, the capitalist class, was consolidated. There was some kind of land reform, but it wasn't really a land reform. It was a fake land reform that essentially gave very plots of land in which people could not support themselves and exist without having a job as well. So they even have something called cooperatives, which that has also been a very faddish movement in the last decade or two. I don't mean in a bad way. It's good to have a cooperative, people working together, but we must recognize that cooperatives will always be under capitalism, unless it's a state run enterprise, because you're working within a capitalist system. So I think it's very important to have a cooperative where people run their own enterprises and have legitimacy and can't sell the enterprise when they're made their profits. They have to maintain it and give it over to the next generation. So in the Philippines, that's not happening. The leaders of the cooperatives are in fact the middlemen, I'll use the male word, between the major corporations like Sumifru, the banana company, Dole, Del Monte, and so forth, and so, United Fruit, their successors, Chiquita Banana, in other countries. But Sumifru is one of the biggest companies in Philippines, and Sumitomo, the Japanese company. I think they just sold their stake in the company, but they continue to profit from it through controlling the, this was a point that was made again and again earlier, by controlling the global value chain. So the workers at the lowest level are making about 10, in this country, okay, you have 1 won. So what is 1/10 of a won? You don't even have change in this country. Like 1/10 of a won per hour. So for 1 day, you'll have 1 won. You make 1 won equivalent, and that would be a high wage for a banana worker in the fields, in the plantations, or in the packing houses. People cannot survive at those wages, and that anyway, this is something that's really become a very crucial issue with respect to India, where people have been forced off the land because a rich kulak class, a rich peasant class has emerged and has forced people off the land, and they've become workers on the land for them, so that by becoming capitalists in some ways. So there are some kind of resemblance, there is a resemblance there to the Soviet Union or Russia before the Soviet Union took place, where you had a rich kulak class in place. of course, it again raises a number of questions about, how you resolve that problem. In India, we're talking about 1.35 billion people. And in South Africa, you have the same dynamic. People do have their backyards where they might be able to farm very little. I mean, you go to the townships surrounding the major cities, which I consider rural, and people, don't have running water, don't have electricity, don't have sanitation. Schools, they do have schools, and but people get by. They are able to tap into electrical sources and so forth, and they're fighting for services. And one can contextualize this within the context of popular democracy. But I would argue that we need more than just popular democracy, or, for instance, people making decisions about how resources are divided within a capitalist system. I think we really do need to think about a transformation of the system. And, I mean, that goes for Germany too. I mean, the German workers also deserve to have a say over how resources are divided up amongst themselves, rather than corporate elites. I hope that answered your questions, but again, each of them are the basis of a panel or a conference, except for the one about, about my life, about my interests, which
너무 장황하게 말씀을 하셔요. 그 점을 좀 지금 영어를 제대로 듣는 분들이 얘기한 거고 어떤 사람이 있어요. 거의 못 들어.
일단은
아니요, 끝나고 나서 제가 갖다 설명.
잠깐 설명을 하시고.
끝나고 말씀드릴게요.
진행.
We have already 20 minutes over, so
okay, sorry.
끝나고가 아니지. 이 진행 중에 이게 주고받고 하려고 왔는데 끝나고
아니, 선생님 원래 이제 7시까지 하고 식사하면서 이제 더 얘기를 하려고 하니까 요거까지 이제 오영 선생님이 간단하게 설명하고 일단
너무 세부적으로 답을 해주셔가지고 시간이 길어질 것 같은데 이제 간단히 설명드리면 첫 번째 질문에 대해서는 사실 이제 이 세 나라에 대해서 각각 다른 그러니까 지속적으로 기본적으로는 글로벌 사우스에 대한 관심이 있었고요. 아까 제가 설명 때 약간 좀 빠졌던 부분들이 이제 이 글로벌 시스템 제국주의의 중요성과 그다음에 인종투쟁, 반제국주의 투쟁을 하고 있던 부분을 강조하셨어요. 굉장히 중요한 부분이고. 개인적으로는 전에 이제 그 제국주의와 반제국주의에 관한 인사이클로피디아를 또 편집을 하셨어요. 그런 관점이 있다고 이제 보시면 되는 거고, 그래서 거의 그 학부 때부터 좀 관심, 이 글로벌 사우스와 이제 제국주의 시스템에 관심을 가져왔던 거고, 뭐 나라별로는 그러니까 남아공은 거의 이제 그 대학원 때부터 관심을 가졌던 나라고, 인도는 90년대 미국의 탈산업화가 되면서 이제 그 산업생산 시설들이 글로벌 사우스로 옮겨가는 과정과 이제 더불어서 이제 관심을 갖게 됐다는 것이고, 필리핀은 이제 최근 상대적으로 최근에 2017년 방문하게 되면서 이제 왔다는 것이고요. 그다음에 이제 각 나라의 이제 정치 권력 국가와 이제 그 노동운동 관계는 하나씩 설명했는데 좀 생략을 하겠습니다. 생략을 하겠고, 그다음에 이제 마지막 농촌에서의 변화. 근데 이 세 나라들은 어떤 면에서는 서로 이렇게 특징이 비슷해지는 유사한 특징을 갖는 좀 수렴 현상을 보이고 있다고 말씀하셨고, 예를 들어서 필리핀 같은 경우는 86년에 이제 혁명이 일어났는데 일어날 당시에는 인종혁명을 했지만 사실상 인종이 빠진 혁명이 되는 거고 또 토지 개혁하는 형태로 됐지만 되지 않았고, 그다음에 이제 협동조합 중요한 형태임에도 불구하고 사실은 다국적 기업의 이제 중개자 역할밖에 못하는 이러면서 사실 이제 농촌지역 전체에서의 이제 다수는 이제 노동자들이 되고 있다라고 하는 것을 이제 현지 방문을 통해서 이제 확인했다는 것이죠. 인도 역시 이제 소수 분홍이 이제 자본가로서 점점 이제 등장하고 있다. 이에 비해서 다수의 농민들이 이제 사실상 노동 배급하고 있는 것이라고 보시는 것이고, 남아공 같은 경우도 사실 이제 그 도시 주변부가 사실상 이제 농촌 지역인데 그쪽은 기본적인 뭐 물, 전기 모든 서비스 제공되지 않는 거니까 그것들을 이제 위한 투쟁들이 이루어지고 있다고 이제 하는 것이고요. 결론적으로 보자면 사실 이제 그 흔히 그 민중 퍼플 데모크라시 민중의 민주주의가 실현되면 문제가 해결될 것이라고 생각을 하지만 이런 그 정치인들이 활동가들도 그런 얘기를 하지만 실제로 그것만으로 부족하다. 근본적인 어떤 변혁들이 있어야 문제를 해결해 나갈 수 있다. 여기 말씀하셨습니다. We almost all of us.
Okay, I put my email on the board. Anybody can call, contact me anytime. I even have a Korean number, so.
일단은 저희들이 이제 오프에서 이제 1시간 정도 지난 다음에 이제 식사를 하고 이제 자유롭게 얘기를 하는데 시간이 이제 좀 초과됐는데요. 온라인에 계신 분들 좀 양해해 주시고요. 일단 여기서 독립적인 그 행사는 마치고 다음에 또 이제 선생님 발레에서 질문이 있으면 나중에 저희들한테 얘기하면 그 질문을 다시 저희들이 전달하도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 일단은 여기서 저희들이 독립적인 행사는 마치겠습니다. 네, 감사합니다.
감사합니다.